The Warring States period in Chinese history comes after the breakdown of the Zhou order, which begins back around the 8th century BCE. And for a couple of hundred years, there's a progressive fragmentation. More and more small states pop up during what we call the Spring and Autumn period that we talked about last time. And then around the year 500 BC or 480 in that vicinity, that process seems to reverse itself, and we get a period where stronger states begin to gobble up the weaker states, and the number of states declines again, so that we go from a peak of maybe around 250 down to smaller and smaller numbers, 150. By the time we get down to the 3rd century BC, there's perhaps only a dozen fairly large states still fighting it out amongst themselves. We'll see the culmination of that process in the next lecture. But today, I want to take a little time to talk about the philosophical response, the questions that people asked, the way that people tried to make sense of the chaos that was taking place around them in China during this period. We talked before about the rise of the shi, the class of professional political administrators who emerged during the Spring and Autumn period as the number of local courts, local royal establishments grew, and people were needed to carry on the administrative activities of government. The literate class, the group of individuals who read the records, wrote the records, used the historical precedents, the knowledge of the past to advise their rulers on government policies. These individuals reflected on the problems that were confronting China, confronting the many states now that constituted China. And they asked questions about why things had gotten to be as difficult as they were. What had gone wrong with the order that had existed? The Zhou, the early Zhou dynasty, had been a period of great success, great expansion and growth. Why had that gone wrong? Why had that broken down? And as a corollary of that, what could be done to put the world back into order? What could be done to fix things? There were many, many responses that different individuals came up with. And we'll talk about some of those today and some of those in the next lecture. But I want to concentrate first on perhaps the most influential figure in Chinese intellectual or philosophical history, and that is Confucius. There are two important schools that remain linked to one another throughout Chinese history from this period on: Confucianism and Taoism. They emerge about the same time. They in some ways represent a polarity of thought about government and good society and a properly ordered world. Confucianism is the one that I'm going to start with, not because it's more important or because it's right and Taoism is wrong or anything like that, but simply because you have to start with one of them, and I'm going to start with Confucianism. We don't know a lot about the historical individuals who started these schools of thought. Confucius lived between about 550 BC and 480 BC. Exact dates are hard to determine. There aren't really contemporary records of him, but we do have information about him written down by his students and their students in later generations. We know, for example, that he spent a fair amount of time traveling around in eastern China, essentially offering his services to the rulers of different states. As we mentioned in a previous lecture, Confucius was from the state of Lu in what is today Shandong province. It was a very successful state, one of the more prosperous states. It was a state that was ruled by a family which traced its descent back to the Duke of Zhou, so a very prestigious ruling house in the state of Lu. And that was where Confucius grew up. That's where he learned his craft, if you will, of politics. He was, of course, a member of this shi elite, this professional administrative class. And as we talked about previously, by this time it was possible for members of the shi class to not simply serve in the place where they were born, but to offer their services to travel around to different locations. And this is what Confucius did. But he wasn't very successful at it. He never seems to have achieved the kind of position that he was looking for, to really be an influential advisor, to guide the affairs of state, to guide the actions of a ruler. He had a number of relatively minor positions, and eventually he gave up this effort to try to achieve political success through serving in administration. He went back to his home state of Lu, and he settled into a longer career as a teacher. And it's from his role as a teacher that we really know about his ideas, because his students and then later individuals that they passed their knowledge on to wrote down many of the things that he said, many of the talks that he gave. And that's the information that we have about Confucius. Confucius's teachings, the core of his ideas, are about human relationships. When he looked at the world around him, when he looked at the problems facing China, and he asked these questions about what went wrong, why are things so messed up, what can we do to put things back in proper order, his response was to say, people need to understand the relationships between human beings in society. If we want a well-ordered society, we want a society in which people can live together peacefully and in prosperity, then we need to recognize that society is a network of human relationships. He saw the family as sort of a microcosm of this. The relationships within the family served for Confucius to represent the kinds of relationships that were desirable in society as a whole. They were relationships that involved, on the one hand, obligations, duties, responsibilities, and on the other hand, bonds of affection and compassion and caring. Confucius defined a set of what we call the 5 great relationships, which were not meant to be an exhaustive catalog of all possible relationships, but were sort of archetypical. They represented how human relations worked in general. But he defined 5 concrete examples which serve to represent this. And these are the relationship between the ruler and the subject, the relationship between father and son, the relationship between husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, and the relationship between friend and friend. Now, 3 of these are family relationships: father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger brother. And this reflects the centrality of the family in Confucian thought. It's not just a coincidence that he chose these 3 as part of the overall 5. All of these relationships have certain characteristics. They're all what we might call hierarchical. That is to say, in each pair, one side plays a leading role and the other side plays a following role. One side is dominant, one side is subordinate. The ruler is dominant over the subject. The father has a leading role in guiding the development and training of his son, who's in a subordinate learning role. The husband and the wife, the elder and younger brother, even in the relationship between friend and friend. This sounds like a more egalitarian relationship. People are just friends. But in Confucius's vision, even in the relationship between friends, there will always be, in any given set of circumstances, one of the two will be older, wiser, more sophisticated, a better baseball player. There'll be some way in which one of the two plays a more leading role and the other plays the role of sort of second fiddle, of following along. That isn't to say that given 2 individuals, they will always be in the same relationship. It may be that in one circumstance, friend A is the leader and friend B the follower. In another set of circumstances, maybe particular traits of friend B might put him in the leading role and friend A in the following role. But in any particular situation, there will be a hierarchical relationship. So these relationships have a hierarchical dimension. But that's not the totality of them. They also have an aspect of reciprocity, which is to say that they're not just top-down. It isn't the ruler is the ruler and the subject is the subject, and therefore the ruler can do whatever they want and the subject is uniformly obligated to obey. or the father and the son, or the husband and the wife, any of the relationships. The ruler, or the father, or the husband, must be a good ruler, or father, or husband. They must fulfill their role in a proper way. They have to do the right thing. If they abuse their role, if they are cruel, if they are exploitive, if they are negligent, then the subject, the son, the wife, is released, in a sense, from the bond of obligation. Okay? The reciprocity of these relationships is what makes them, in many ways, really work. Because otherwise, it's just a power thing. It's just a dictatorial thing. And top-down power may be effective in certain circumstances, but it's not the basis for building a long, living, functional society. It's not the basis for viable relationships. So for Confucius, the dual nature of human relationships is central to his ideas. They're hierarchical. People should, in normal circumstances, understand their role, whether they're leading or following, and they should fulfill that role. They should act that role out appropriately. But it's based upon the necessary fulfillment of these reciprocal obligations. The subject has an obligation to the ruler, but the ruler has obligations to the subject. If both sides are fulfilling their roles properly, then society will function smoothly. Everything will be as it should be. Now, these relationships structure society, but to make them work, obviously, people need to know where they stand. People need to understand the system of relationships as they encounter it, as it actually exists out there in the world around them. To do that, to make it easier to enact relationships properly, Confucius relies on ritual. He sees ritual as central to the operations, the sort of day-to-day operations, the implementation, if you will, of this order of relationships. Ritual it can be anything. It can be something very simple. When two people meet on the street in our society, they shake hands. And that action of shaking hands is a ritual gesture. It's a gesture which, in our system, indicates, hi, we're on a level of equality. We're on a level of mutual interaction here. But it's a ritual gesture. Or a ritual can be something very elaborate, a college graduation or a presidential inauguration, something like that, which involves large numbers of people performing certain actions in certain ways and has music and colorful uniforms or costumes or something like that. Ritual can be very elaborate, it can be very simple, it can be anywhere in between. But ritual serves to facilitate the enactment of the relationships that Confucius suggests are central to a well-functioning society. Now, in looking back at history, in looking at the condition of China during the Warring States period, what Confucius says is, this is the key. This is where things went wrong. Things went wrong in China when people violated the proper ritual order. Ritual structures the way that we interact. Ritual marks the relationships of a properly ordered society. So he looks back and he says, as we talked about before, back there in the 8th century BCE, when people started taking for themselves the title of king, when people started performing at their local courts the rituals of royalty, when people started wearing the garments of the Zhou kings, they violated the proper ritual. They broke with the right way of ordering society. All the chaos, all the warfare, all the suffering that has been afflicting China stems from that violation of the ritual order. And so for Confucius, the initial actions, the basic program, what Confucius advocates as how to fix things, he talks about returning to the rites, returning to the ritual order of the early Zhou. Not necessarily in terms of going back and figuring out exactly what color robes they wore in the year 1000 BC or something like that, but returning to the properly ordered ritual system which was characteristic of the early Zhou, rather than the chaotic order or lack of order, chaotic disorder of the Warring States period. He also advocates something called the rectification of names. At one point, Confucius is asked, what would you do if you were given power? He had, of course, gone around looking to be an advisor to a ruler. One of his students says, what would you do if you were given power? And he says, well, the first thing I would do would be to rectify names, to make the names fit reality. And this is a reference, of course, to the usurpation of the title of king by the first of the hegemons back in the 8th century. They should have stuck with their proper titles. If everyone used the proper terminology, then the world would be a properly ordered place. So ritual order, linguistic order, human relationships understood, properly defined, everyone acting out the role in which they belong, this would lead to the restoration of a properly ordered system, a properly ordered society for China. A critical individual in this process is what Confucius calls the gentleman. In Chinese, it's the junzi. The gentleman is the individual who acts sort of as a model. He models the correct behavior. He models the proper ritual order in himself. He engages in learning. He learns about the past. Obviously, he's an educated gentleman, a member of this sure elite. And he seeks to approach what we call the proper way. There's a very important term here, the Tao. The Tao means the way. The word literally means a path, a walkway. But it means the way of proper order, the way that we should live in the world about us. By promoting and seeking to manifest a proper order, by seeking to embody the way, if you will, the gentleman provides an ideal role model that everyone else can then learn from and emulate. Well, Confucius died around 480 BC. About 150 years later, a man named Mencius came along who picked up on many of the teachings of Confucius and further developed his ideas. He elaborated more fully the doctrine of the great relationships, and he specifically turned his attention to the relationship between ruler and subject and developed these concepts in a way that emphasized the performative obligations of rulership. He talked about the necessity of the ruler to do the right thing, and that when the ruler violated this, the people had a right to overthrow him, to change the government that they had. And of course, in some ways, this is a Confucian expression of the old doctrine of the mandate of heaven. Mencius talks about it in terms of the human relationship between ruler and subject, but it is deeply embedded in the conceptual order of the mandate of heaven. If the ruler abuses his relationship, his role, he's going to lose the mandate. And we can tell he loses the mandate. The people have the right to overthrow him. Well, Confucianism, as you can tell from the way I've just described it, has a fairly positive vision of the world and how to deal with it. Confucianism tells us that there is a proper order for society, that we can know what that proper order is, and that it is the obligation of the individual, particularly the gentleman, to seek to restore that order, to seek to create, to foster that order. Taoism is rather in contrast with this. Taoism takes a position or a set of positions that form sort of the opposite end of a polarity with Confucianism. Where Confucianism is very proactive, Taoism is very skeptical. Taoism, if you can say this, Taoism advocates inaction. Okay? Now, Taoism emerges from the thought of an individual that's called Lao-Tzu. Lao-Tzu, the term just means old master. We know even less about the life of Lao-Tzu than we know about the life of Confucius. Indeed, it's not 100% sure that there ever was a historical individual who was Lao-Tzu. We have a text which is called Lao-Tzu, which is purportedly written by this individual. He supposedly lived about the same time as Confucius. He was reportedly from one of the other minor states. There are legends that at one point Confucius and Lao Tzu actually met, had a debate, in which Lao Tzu made Confucius look like something of a chump. These stories obviously were mostly told by the Taoists. The text that we have by Lao Tzu, and then just as Mencius developed the ideas of Confucius at a later time, Lao Tzu has a later follower, a man called Zhuangzi. His writings as well develop a perspective on society, on government, on morality, which is radically at odds with that of Confucianism, in that it is based upon a skepticism about knowledge, a skepticism about epistemology, our ability to know things. For Confucius, yes, we know things. We know a proper order. We know how to go about achieving it. We should do that. For the Taoists, all knowledge is arbitrary and partial. When we think about knowledge, when we talk about knowledge, what we're really talking about is language, is our ability to communicate. How do we know things? We know things by talking about them, by giving them names. And we've seen that for Confucius, giving things names was very important. The rectification of names was, for Confucius, the place where he would start in putting the world back to order. But for the Taoists, names are just made up. Names are just arbitrary. How do we know that an orange is an orange? It's just a word. It's just something that we make up to describe something in reality. But to mistake the language for the reality is a problem. We can never know things in their entirety. We can never know everything about any particular subject or situation. So our knowledge, the basis for our actions, is always partial. It's always limited. There's always a lot of stuff that we can't take into account because we simply can't know it all. The capacity of the mind to comprehend things is finite, is limited. So our knowledge is always partial. When we act on the basis of partial knowledge, there are going to be consequences which we can't anticipate. And of course, in Western thought, we have this common sort of common sense idea about the law of unintended consequences. When you do things, there's always consequences that weren't what you meant. Well, this is in some ways, a very Taoist idea, that when we act, we don't know what the result of our actions are going to be. And indeed, often, in trying to make things better, we simply wind up confusing things or making things worse. Zhuangzi, the follower of Lao Tzu, who develops these concepts down around the 3rd century BCE, spends a lot of time. Zhuangzi likes to tell fables. He likes to tell stories. And he spends a lot of time playing with the idea of knowledge. He writes about a great bird that soars so high in the sky that when it looks down on the ground, it just sees sort of patterns of color. It doesn't see individual trees or rocks or animals or anything like that. And by contrast, a little sparrow that hops around on the ground and never gets up very high above the tops of the trees and sees everything up close, sees all the little grains in the stalks of wheat and sees all the little ants and bugs around on the ground. Who's right? Well, neither one is right and neither one is wrong. It's simply a matter of your perspective, of where you're looking from. Zhuangzi also has the very famous story of a dream. He dreams that he's a butterfly, but then maybe he's a butterfly dreaming that he's Zhuangzi. And when he wakes up, he's not sure whether he's the Zhuangzi who was dreaming of a butterfly or whether he's now the Zhuangzi that's the butterfly's dream. So he's this questioning of knowledge, this questioning of our ability to know things. This is fundamental to the Taoist position. This has further implications for politics, for government. I don't want to suggest that Taoists aren't concerned with the problems facing China, because they are. In fact, Lao Tzu, in one of the final chapters of the book that has his name, lays out a vision of a well-ordered society, which in some ways resonates quite nicely with that of Confucianism. but in other ways is very different. Lao Tzu writes that the ideal society, the ideal life in some ways, is one in which you live in a village. It's a small village. It's just a regular Chinese village. And you can hear the dogs barking and the roosters crowing in the next village. But in your whole life, you never go there. Right? And the reason you never go there is because everything you need, everything you desire, is right where you are. It's right in your own village. Why go to the village next door where you hear the dogs barking and the roosters crowing? You have dogs and roosters in your own village. Right? All the things that you should want, all the things that you need, the food, shelter, human relationships, are to be found in your immediate community, in the place where you already live. To want to go to the next village is just like wanting to conquer the world. It doesn't lead you anywhere. All it does is take you out of the proper order, the proper environment where you really belong. So Taoism presents a view of things which undermines, which negates the positivism of Confucianism. One of the critical terms or concepts in Taoism in Chinese is Wu Wei. And Wu Wei is really hard to translate. Again, it's one of these situations where taking terms out of Chinese and plugging them into English is a little problematic. What it basically means is don't do it. It means it's generally translated as inaction. But that's a little misleading. It doesn't mean don't do anything. It doesn't mean, you shouldn't get up in the morning and have breakfast and go out and work in the fields and do those things. What it means instead is don't act in a way which goes against sort of the natural flow of things. Okay? There is a natural order to things. There's a sort of natural community, a way of being, a way of living, which exists by itself, sort of functions by itself, the way that your village does, the way that a naturally occurring community of human activity does. The people in the village live their lives, raise their crops, have their dogs and their roosters. That's a natural order of things. Doing that is just being. Okay, the term in Wu Wei, the term Wei, means acting in a conscious way, acting in a making sort of way, a way that goes out and seeks to make new things. Okay, that's what you don't want to do. You want to act in a way that's just in harmony with the natural order. Okay, so for the Taoists, the point isn't to make the world a better place. When you set out to make the world a better place, you're just going to mess it up further because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know all the necessary information. The skepticism, the aversion to a vision of a positive order, this is what comes to characterize Taoism. And it's just a polar contrast with the positivism that Confucius articulates. Now these two systems, well, it may be a little early to call them systems yet. These two sets of ideas emerge during this Warring States period, and they represent a polarity of response, one very positive, one very negative, or not negative, but skeptical, two ways of thinking about restoring a proper order and what the nature of that order would be. They share a lot. They share a lot of ideas about the order. In fact, I mentioned for Confucius that he's concerned with the Tao, the way, the proper way of being, and that's exactly what the Taoists talk about. It's called Taoism. It's the same word, the Tao, because they're also concerned with the way, the proper order of being. The difference between them simply being that for the Confucianists, the Tao is something that we go out and actively seek to foster and create and develop. Whereas for the Taoists, per se, the followers of Lao Tzu, the Tao is simply something which we have to let be in and of itself. We have to let it sort of go with the flow and do its own thing and just be its natural order. That polarity remains deep in Chinese political culture ever after. It's not the totality of the range of ideas that emerge in the warring states, but we'll turn to some others in our next lecture.